Welcome back, gentles and ladiesmen, to my 3-part mega review of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. It's finally time to talk about DAT gameplay. Before I get into the obvious, I want to address one of the consistent overarching complaints about Skyward Sword. Many accuse Skyward Sword of being old hat, of offering no new additions to the formula, of being the same old Zelda game we've already played a million times. I'd certainly agree that when it comes to the overall Zelda formula, Skyward Sword stops well short of reinventing the wheel. The game does, however, add quite a few new game mechanics such that it separates itself from previous games in the Zelda series. And I also think that this whole perception that the Zelda series is super formulaic and repetitive is somewhat misplaced. Just look at all the home console releases since Ocarina of Time hit the Nintendo 64 in 1998. Each one had a unique overworld to explore. Each had a creative arsenal of new items to play around with. Each one has had its own art style. The overarching formula of going to dungeons, finding keys, and killing bosses has stayed relatively untouched, but enough has changed between releases to keep it fresh and interesting. If we're going to be calling anything old hat, check out Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception. I can't believe they're making another one. So, onto the mechanics. The biggest change to Link's moveset right off the bat is the addition of a run button. Link can now dash to climb up steep walls or across dangerous quicksand. It doesn't sound like much at first, but like the addition of the dash and wall jump in Mega Man X, it makes a pretty radical change to Skyward Sword's design. It also does away with all that side jumping bullshit. Seriously, the run button makes Link so much faster that when I sat down to record some Ocarina footage for this review, I was amazed at how much slower Link felt in that game. You can't run forever though. Also introduced in Skyward Sword is a fatigue meter. If you run too far and for too long, then Link will poop himself out and be unable to move for about 10 tedious seconds. Climbing around on vines or doing spin attacks will also deplete your fatigue meter. I have mixed feelings about this whole thing. On one hand, I love the extra speed. I love being able to jump across vines and whatnot. And I also understand that doing some of these actions would realistically make Link a little winded. On the other hand, there are parts of this game that require you to stand around while the gauge replenishes. There are also these few points where a gap is just barely small enough for you to cross before the damn meter runs out, like this one quicksand pit in the Sandship dungeon. So you have to sit on your ass and wait for Link to recompose himself for each of the 15 times he has to cross this thing. You can buy a special potion to extend your meter a little bit, but it's only temporary and costs a hefty sum of rupees. I'd like for these new abilities to remain part of Link's moveset, but if the fatigue meter has to be there, I either need to be able to permanently upgrade the damn thing, or it needs to last longer to begin with. While this whole thing isn't perfect, it's still a great addition to Link's moveset. The inventory system has also been revamped. In Twilight Princess, items got a special wheel that pulled up instantly with the push of a button. Kind of like the quick select in Ratchet & Clank. It was awesome, and much more convenient than having to wait 200 years for Ocarina's menu cube to slowly pop up. Skyward Sword simplifies it even more, and while I was apprehensive about that at first, I've come to like it. Items like shields and empty bottles now get stored in your adventure pouch and can be pulled up with the minus button. Whatever doesn't fit in your pouch can be put into storage or pulled out at your leisure. You can purchase extra slots so that you can hold more items. Normal items like the slingshot or bombs get mapped to the B button and can be pulled up and swapped easily. While it would be nice to equip more than one of these items at once, I still think it's an overall functional and convenient reworking of the inventory system. Like Wind Waker and some other games in the series, Skyward Sword also has a system of collectibles to find and bugs to catch in the overworld that can be used for a number of purposes. You can sell these items, or Gondo here can use them to upgrade your equipment, something that I think was a really cool idea. Unfortunately, there are a couple of cockamamie design choices that prevent this interesting idea from reaching its full potential. One thing that really grinds my gears is that every time you start a new play session, the game feels the need to pull up a 10-second text box for every new type of bug or collectible you find, regardless of how many times you found them in previous play sessions. My god, is that annoying as fucking hell. I know what Elden Aura is, game. You don't have to keep telling me every single time I press the power button on my Wii. Seriously, did the playtesters not notice how annoying this is? While the upgrade system itself is a great idea and something that I'd love to see return in the upcoming Wii U game, it's kind of annoying that I not only need to track down an arbitrary number of specific collectibles, but also pay out a hefty sum of rupees. And the only way you can check to see if you had the stuff you need is to go all the way back to Skyloft and talk to Gondo. It would have been nice to be able to see this information from the pause menu so I know when I can stop farming Tumbleweed. Again, the upgrades are well worth your time, and I think it's a great addition. Just fix what I mentioned and you're golden. And now it's time to talk about a more divisive addition to Skyward Sword, Link's new sword control. Now, I've never played the Wii version of Twilight Princess, but because the game was both a launch title and a port of a GameCube game, I imagine that the motion-controlled sword probably wasn't very sophisticated, and that combat with enemies involved a lot of motion mashing. I could be wrong, but that would be my educated guess. Skyward Sword, again, was built from the ground up to take the utmost advantage of the Wii's most latent capabilities, and in my opinion, the game's use of motion control is Skyward Sword's single greatest strength. I think I ought to express my feelings on motion control in general before I proceed. My perception is that nobody nowadays can seem to fucking stand it. But if you guys can think back to the announcement of the Wii back in the mid-2000s, you'll remember that this wasn't always the case. People used to think it was revolutionary, the natural progression and future of the gaming medium. And there was a lot of potential, to be sure. Unfortunately, many third-party game developers only saw motion control as just a fleeting and gimmicky craze, and because of that, that's mostly what motion control ended up becoming, and most people have understandably come to see it that way. And I honestly don't blame them. For all the great first-party games available on the Nintendo Wii, like Super Mario Galaxy, and awesome third-party games like Sonic Colors, there are at least 50 pieces of lazy shovelware shit surrounding them. With the 7th generation drawing to a definitive close behind us, motion control has all but faded back into the ether from whence it came. But if there is one game on the Nintendo Wii that really understands the true unharnessed potential of motion control, it is The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. In fact, I will go on record as saying that Skyward Sword has made the best use of motion control of any game I've ever played. It makes me genuinely upset that it wasn't used as well as it could have been. The most obvious use of motion control would be Link's sword. While the combat in previous 3D games was definitely more fleshed out than the top-down 2D games, and defeating enemies required a certain sense of strategy and experimenting with your items, a majority of most basic enemies could be defeated by mashing the B button until they died. The Wii Motion Plus control introduced in Skyward Sword changes enemy combat considerably. People who have spent little time with the Nintendo Wii are probably inclined to think that it just replaces button mashing with motion mashing, but nothing could be farther from the truth. Link can now slice in 8 different directions, aim his spin attack however he wishes, thrust it forward to stab enemies, and use his shield to bounce back attacks, and the movement of his sword responds almost perfectly to the player's own body movements. Because Link's sword has a considerably greater degree of control, he can now slash at enemies from specific directions in order to get around defenses or hit weak points. He can thrust into enemies to hit them at specific points. He can knock back projectiles with well-aimed slashes. He can activate switches or use his sword to turn dials. This isn't just a lazy gimmick, folks. This is a fully fleshed out game mechanic that the combat and puzzles were designed around. There's always something new that Link can do with his sword, things that he could never have done with a button and an analog stick. The swordplay in Skyward Sword is such a remarkable improvement to the overall combat that if the upcoming Wii U Zelda were to remove this functionality, I would consider it a significant step backwards. Granted, the control scheme in this game does have a considerable learning curve. When I first played Skyward Sword back in 2011, I got my shit wrecked by even the most basic enemies. But because I was patient and persevered, I've not only acquired quite a bit of skill, but I've also grown to love it more than the old swordplay of previous games. And that's not all the motion control is used for. Skyward Sword has some great items available that all make use of it in some way or another. For example, bombs return, now sporting a nice pronounced arc so you know where the fuck the damn thing's gonna land. Not only can you throw them over your head like before, but you can also roll them into small gaps or slowly down steep hills. The obligatory bow weapon makes an appearance, and because of the Wii pointer controls, along with a much needed aiming reticle, lining up shots and landing them on distant targets has never been simpler or so much fun. One of my personal favorites is the new Beetle, which you can fly around to hit switches around corners, kill enemies, or drop bombs. You might have guessed that Link gets to ride around in his Crimson Loftwing at some point, and you'd be right. If you played Super Mario Galaxy 2, then you have a pretty good idea how it controls. And damn, it's not only intuitive, but smooth as buttered ice. Though the bird can admittedly feel pretty slow sometimes, controlling it is so much fun that I almost don't notice. Swimming makes use of the pointer to give Link his most versatile swimming control since Majora's Mask. Even the menus can be navigated by snapping the Wii Remote in general directions, something I found myself wanting to use more than the control stick alternative. In the rare moments that the Wii Motion Plus becomes unresponsive, you can recalibrate it from the menu at any time, and you're given the ability to recenter the pointer controls at the touch of a button, a feature I love oh so much. Obviously not everyone is pleased by the motion control, and I understand why. It's definitely not the sort of thing that everyone has the patience or interest to learn. If people prefer the more traditional control scheme, more power to them. I know for a fact that there are people out there who would disagree with me when it comes to the more precise combat in this game. I know of one in particular who dislikes that every enemy has to be a puzzle, quote unquote. Look, no offense to these people, but have you been living under a rock for the past 25 some years? Since Zelda 1, the combat has required Link to use certain strategies and approaches to tackle different kinds of enemies. That's what makes fighting the enemies a fun and satisfying part of the gameplay, rather than a tedious chore that wears out its welcome by the second dungeon. The only difference this time around is that motion control is involved, which the larger gaming population seems to hold a negative bias against. But I can still understand why some people might not find fighting enemies like bokoblins to be the greatest thing ever. While the game seems to want me to slash at them from a particular angle, the enemies always seem to cover their flanks before you can strike them. Most of the time I either sneak up on them or use spin attacks to catch them off guard. But to the game's credit, if I don't want to fight bokoblins by slicing at them, there are several alternative strategies for taking them out. If you can bounce their attacks off your shield, they'll be staggered just long enough for you to come in for the kill. A well-aimed slingshot bullet will also stun them long enough for you to slice them to ribbons. An arrow to the forehead will also do the trick. Don't like fighting those quadrobabas? No problem, just chuck a bomb at them and they'll do the rest. Or you can use the beetle to snip their necks clean through. Don't want to have to motion mash those bats? Just crack that whip, it's got a longer reach. The point I'm making here is that the combat in Skyward Sword has a lot of depth and intentionality. If you can take the time to experiment with your items, you'll find that fighting enemies has never been more versatile, interesting, or fun, and the bosses only build on this. These are some of the most interesting boss fights in the whole entire series, though it should be noted that there are a few repeats here and there. But even when there are, you can expect a change to the boss's attack cycle and moveset, so it almost feels new. One of my personal favorites is Koloktos, an ancient guardian robot. To defeat him, you have to unscrew all of his arms with the whip and use one of his swords to bash open his chassis. It's a thrilling confrontation that keeps you on your toes. So obviously I'm a huge fan of the combat and controls offered in Skyward Sword, but how much fun is it to run around the surface or fly through Skyloft? Well, if I have any real complaints about Skyward Sword from a gameplay perspective, then the overworld is the big one. One of the things that made Twilight Princess such a blast to play was the treatment it gave to Hyrule. Hyrule had never been so big, so fleshed out, and like the classic games, there were plenty of hidden caves and optional areas to scavenge around for rupees and heart pieces and whatnot. It was so much fun just riding around the overworld on Epona's back, slashing or shooting away at anything that got close. When I think of Hyrule and what it looks like, I don't think of Ocarina's version, I don't think of A Link to the Past version, I think of Twilight Princess's version. As for Skyward Sword, well, there are only really 4 areas. There's Skyloft, obviously, then there's Faron Woods, which was already a place that you could go to in Twilight Princess, then there's Elden Volcano, which would later be known as Death Mountain, and then there's Lanayru Desert. And that's it. You know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of the boring-ass sectors from Other M's Bottle Ship, and how they were nothing but generic level design archetypes. The overworld in Skyward Sword is admittedly much better designed and more interesting to play than the Bottle Ship, but a number of my complaints still apply. While the overworld in this game is technically bigger than the one in Twilight Princess, it most certainly doesn't feel like it. The woods, volcano, and desert areas each have a bunch of sub-areas that make the areas more interesting than they could have been. But ultimately, I still feel like they're a little too generic and few in number to match up to overworlds of previous Zelda games. It's not like there isn't anything to do, there's plenty of heart pieces and side quest items to track down, but it's still a far cry from the freedom of exploration I've come to expect from this series. Lanayru Desert is definitely my personal favorite though. 2 words: time shift stones. What a great addition to the overworld design. If only the woods and volcano could have had something like that, then maybe running around them wouldn't be so underwhelming. And what exacerbates this problem is Skyward Sword's structure. You're going to be spending more time in the overworld than any Zelda installment yet released. Hell, even more so than Majora's Mask. As I mentioned in the last part, Skyward Sword more or less follows the same basic cycle. Arrive in area. Do fetch quest to explore area. Find access to local dungeon. Finish dungeon and collect MacGuffin. Rinse and repeat. It can get pretty tedious, and I understand why a lot of people don't like it because I'm one of them. Because of the game's railroaded structure and lackluster overworld, the game feels considerably more linear than other Zelda adventures. Zelda titles released since Skyward Sword have made an effort to be more non-linear, and I personally welcome this change of pace, and hope that Nintendo continues to learn from the mistakes made with Skyward Sword's overworld. The dungeons, on the other hand, are pretty damn fun. They're just the right length, contain some tricky and devious puzzles, offer a fun sense of exploration, and are just overall well designed and fun to play. The amount and variety of dungeons certainly isn't as good as, say, Twilight Princess, but Skyward Sword has some pretty memorable ones as well. My favorites from both an aesthetic and design standpoint are the Ancient Cistern and the Sand Ship. The only dungeon I really don't like is the final dungeon, the Sky Keep. 2 words. Slide puzzles. If any of you ever saw my Finding Nemo video game review before I took it down, you know that I can't stand these fucking things. And the fact that I have to slide them around in order to find my way forward is a severe pain in my ass. Why can't Link just pick the pieces up and arrange them in an optimal pattern? They're not like glued or bolted down or anything. Hell, they even raise up when you put your cursor over them. It takes forever, and for some reason you're not allowed to move the square you're standing in. It's not a horrible dungeon, but it can be really annoying. Overall though, the dungeons are pretty fun. So it's time to address the final complaint people have regarding the gameplay of Skyward Sword. Skyward Sword is by far the most streamlined Zelda experience that has ever existed when it comes to progression. I don't think I ever got lost, and that's certainly a good thing. As much as I can respect the influence and impact of the original Legend of Zelda on NES, I find playing it a pain in the ass because the game does a shitty job giving you any sort of indication as to where to go or what to do. Some sort of guide or walkthrough is pretty much required if you want to finish it. I know I sure as hell needed one. Skyward Sword has the exact opposite problem. I mentioned in my Jak and Daxter review that I'm personally a fan of Fi, the spirit who resides in Link's sword, from both a practicality perspective and from a character perspective. She has so many functions that she's easily the most useful companion character in the entire series. If you get stuck in a dungeon, she'll give you a hint as to how to solve a puzzle. For the first time since Majora's Mask, you can lock onto enemies to learn their names and how to defeat them. If you forget what the hell you're supposed to be doing between play sessions, you can ask her what your current objective is. You can use the sword in first person to douse for MacGuffins and get yourself headed in the right direction. She has a lot of useful features that I would like to see come back in future games if possible. Now, if all these hints were optional and only available when the player asked for them, I think that Fi could satisfy Zelda newbies and veterans alike. The problem is that beyond all the other hints available at the player's request, she feels the need to constantly explain stuff that most people could figure out on their own given enough time. I think the worst example is the Pirate's Fortress. At this point in the game, you've already seen plenty of time shift stones and know what they do. In the aforementioned mini-dungeon, you come across this time shift orb that you can carry around with you. I think most people could see the time shift circle and figure out what it is and what it does. And even if they couldn't, just picking it up and walking around with it would be enough. But for some reason that I can't fathom, Fi decides to pop up and explain it anyway. And she does this sort of shit all the time, I swear. I like to imagine that whenever Link goes to the bathroom, Fi probably pops up to tell him how to flush.
Master, you can flush your poop by pushing the handle.
Yes, Fi, I know. Look folks, I can get over pressing the A button a couple extra times here and there, and again, I'd prefer I know what the hell I'm supposed to be doing rather than wandering around like a jackass trying to figure out where to go. But after a while, all the hints start to come off as, for lack of a better word, hand-holding. For the most part, Fi will never show up and directly tell you word for word what to do, so there are still plenty of puzzles to solve and secrets to figure out on your own, but that only makes Fi's explanation of the obvious minute stuff all the more redundant. The enemy identification of all of Fi's other features can stay on, but please, for the love of Nairu, keep the hand-holding to a minimum next time. Again, it's not the worst thing ever, but I would be lying if I said I didn't find it a little bit annoying. Of course, this wouldn't be a Zelda game without Dem side quests, and holy shit is there a lot of them. Seriously, I tacked on another 10 parts worth of recording because I thought it would be a good idea to do an all-heart piece run. The biggest one is the Betroth side quest. Betroth is a kind-hearted demon whose only wish is to become human and befriend the denizens of Skyloft. In order to do this, Betroth requires 80 special gratitude crystals, which Link can find in places all over Skyloft, or by doing favors for the other Skyloftians. These favors can range from fetch quests where you go down to the surface to bring back objects that drop below the clouds, to cleaning this one lazy bitch's house. After every 10 or so, Betroth rewards Link with some useful items, including a heart piece and the game's wallet upgrades. The Betroth side quest is a good time sink if you're bored of the main adventure and want to get some worthwhile items. I also found that doing these side quests did wonders for building both the characters and the world that Skyward Sword has to offer. The Lumpy Pumpkin side quest has some really interesting minigames and nets you 2 pieces of heart, and I honestly grew to really like the father and daughter owners by the time I was done. But that doesn't mean that every part of the larger Betroth side quest is fun. Trying to help Fledge get into shape is an extremely tedious process that requires you to spend a hefty sum of rupees on potions and get into and out of bed over and over again. And that stupid pumpkin shooting minigame that you have to play to get that piece of heart? Fuck it. Fuck it to hell. I spent a good hour and 20 minutes trying to beat this damn thing. Seriously, I'm not kidding. I still have the footage. But by far the worst side quest in the whole game involves this item check clerk named Petrus. After visiting the item check enough, you'll start to see her crushing on you. If you go and sleep in her bed while her overprotective father is in the same room, yes, I'm dead serious, and keep visiting her in her house at night and her job during the day, a process that took me a good 20 minutes to complete, she'll eventually confront you and ask if you really do have a thing for her. And if you want those gratitude crystals, which you ought to since you just spent all of that time talking to her over and over again, you'd better say yes. I'm sorry folks, but this side quest just makes me uncomfortable as fuck. I feel like a terrible person sleeping in some random chick's bed over and over again, and manipulating her feelings just so I can get 5 gratitude crystals. Never again. You can also search around the overworld for goddess cubes, which unlock corresponding chests up in the clouds. You can get some useful medals, pouches, heart pieces, and even an empty bottle, so it's worth it to hunt these things down. My favorite side quest in the game involves the Thunder Dragon, Lanairu. When you meet up with him in the last chunk of the game, you can refight old bosses as a means of netting a piece of heart, a shit ton of rupees, and even the Hylian shield, which is by far the best shield in the game. But what's this? I don't have enough room in my pouch? It was sent to the item check. Oh, hi Petrus. Yes, I still love you, darling. I think it's a good fun challenge, and if you're running low on rupees, it's a great way to make some really quickly. With some very obvious exceptions here and there. The side quests in Skyward Sword are pretty fun overall. Alright, gentles and ladiesmen, it's time to talk about the final boss. It's time for the spoiler section.
Ah, spoiler alert!
If you're watching this part, I'm assuming, as usual, that you've beaten the game already. Because I already went over the plot in detail in part 2, I'm just gonna cut to the chase here. After 40 or so hours of gameplay, Link hunts down the Triforce and uses it to squish Demise, the ancient Demon King. And again, I must ask why Hylia didn't think to give that a try for herself, but I digress. Though Link believes he's won, Demon Lord Girahim, Demise's right-hand man, kidnaps Zelda as a means of resurrecting the Demon King in the past. After a flashy and fun boss battle, Girahim is brought to his knees, but his ritual successful and Demise uses Zelda's soul to resurrect himself. Demise reverts Girahim to his true form, an evil master sword known as the Demon Blade, and enters battle with Link. Personally, I really get a kick out of this boss battle. Demise will wreck your shit if your handle on the controls isn't good, but if you can learn to block his attacks with well-timed shield strikes, you can get a couple of slashes in on him. Again, I can't tell you how much I love the combat in this game. The final boss music is also pretty kick-ass if I do say so myself. After using lightning-powered Skyward strikes to stun lock him, Link deals the finishing blow to Demise. Demise, as he slowly fades away, places a curse, what I like to call the Zelda cycle, upon Link and Zelda, saying that an incarnation of his hatred shall hunt their ancestors for the rest of time. Dat sound familiars? His remains are sealed within the Master Sword, Zelda and Link are reunited, and everyone lives happily ever after. And that was The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. And to get back to my original question, is it really that bad? Hell no! I can certainly understand why so many people out there were disappointed with this game. The collection and upgrade system, while a great idea, has some minor detractions that prevent it from being as polished or interesting as it could have been. The story is full of plot holes that start to damage the purposefulness of the gameplay. The overworld, while still fun enough to run around in, is a step backward from those of previous games. The overabundance of tutorials and statements of the obvious slow down the experience and make the game come off as though it's holding your hand. Despite this, I still find the positives of Skyward Sword to far outweigh the negatives. The combat is the best that any Zelda game has ever had, thanks to its responsive and well-utilized swordplay. The game's overall use of motion control is smart and varied, and thus becomes the best use of the technology I have yet experienced. While the overworld may not be the best, the dungeons are still pretty kick-ass. The side quests are also pretty fun, and the bosses are some of the best in the series' history. The art direction and aesthetic is not only pleasing to the eye, but creative as well, and the soundtrack is fantastic. While I think the overarching plot may have its share of problems, I really do enjoy the world that Skyward Sword has built, as well as all of the great characters that inhabit it. Is it the best Zelda game of all time? Not in my personal opinion. As much as I really do hate to admit it, I do agree with Egoraptor's assertion that Skyward Sword is an instance of the Naughty Dog effect. Because let's be honest, this game does have its share of flaws. Flaws that prevent the game from being worthy of a perfect 10 review score. And this is coming from someone who not only enjoys Skyward Sword, but is also a big fan of the Zelda series in general. While I do consider GameSpot's 7.5 review score to be a bit low due to my disagreeing with them on the swordplay, I can at least respect them for trying to give Skyward Sword some honest objective analysis, instead of just stroking its dick for being a Zelda game. What arbitrary fuck all out of 10 review score would I give it? A 9, 8.5 out of fish. Skyward Sword is neither a tragic misfire nor an exceptional masterpiece. Skyward Sword may not be the best game of all time, but it's very much an enjoyable one, and in my opinion, that's all that matters. And with that, my 3-part mega review of Skyward Sword is finally over. Like with Other M, I want to hear thoughts from you guys. What did you think of Skyward Sword? What would you like to see return in Zelda Wii U? And what do you think is better off forgotten? It was interesting to hear all of these different perspectives on Other M, so I'm just as interested to hear what you guys have to say about this game. After this long summer of constantly uploading for Game Mavericks, and uploading a new video every 2 weeks or so, I think I deserve some time off. I'm delaying the undisclosed marathon until I have a chance to record it. If for some strange mysterious reason you aren't sick of my voice already, I'll still be uploading for Game Mavericks in the meanwhile, so you guys can check me out there. Until next time, I'm ExoParadigmGamer, and I hope you guys enjoyed this exorbitantly, ridiculously long mega review.